All right, everybody, we are here back another Sunday with the Meta World Gaming Podcast.
What's
With
going
you
on, boys?
tonight, we got the homeboys, we got Juggernaut and Baka. We'll have Santon in a little bit, but he's caught up on a boat right now.
Currently
But
trapped on a boat trying to fend for his last pieces of Exodia before they get thrown off. So, just trying to make sure he gets back with all his cards.
but yeah, today we're gonna talk about the meta. We're gonna talk about what is going to be upcoming for this week, what you can expect, what maybe some calls you can make in preparation. But we're definitely gonna let it marinate, let the boys get in, give them a little time.
What's going on, Jenga? Yeah, there's actually a good bit of stuff to talk about here with the 1.82 updates. Honestly, a lot of stuff went in directions I wasn't expecting. Just the whole meta in general, I really wasn't expecting for a lot of people to make the deck choices that they were going to. Not saying that anything that is S tier right now is necessarily a bad choice or anything like that, but I just think it's a bit questionable the way that people reacted to the updates. I think that's kind of where I'm at. And a lot of decks became better and worse based off of like what felt like incorrect decisions from other people, which then solidified some of those like these other decisions as correct, which is weird, just the way the meta shifted. There's just certain decks that I don't think are as much worse as people gave them credit for, or much better, and then people either dumped those decks or picked up these new ones, and then the whole meta just kind of shifted around a lot,
Right, it's
solidifying the position
always
where a lot of
it
things
it
settled.
definitely reinforces the idea that the game is heavily dictated by what the players choose, not necessarily what is the best deck.
Oh, for
Um,
sure, yeah. It definitely just because the game is so matchup dependent. It is just so based off of like if too many people are playing one deck, you can't play X decks.
right.
Like Heimerdinger is, and we often say in our opinion is the best deck right now. But if everybody just decided to only play Noxus Piltover decks on ladder every single day forever, it's then obviously it just can't be the best deck. Even though in a vacuum it should be, and for something like tournament play, it definitely would be. But if everyone on ladder just decides to play the hard counter, you kind of have to move with the meta, and it's like, well, this is the best deck provided X case doesn't come up. Which is it's just an odd thought to think about in a game like this. It's something you don't really see ever in traditional card games for the most part, especially because of sideboards. I mean, and just having one deck formats where you're not playing against such a wide variety of decks. But all right, what are we thinking of the first S tier deck to discuss here?
We could definitely start off with a deck we're all very familiar deck, or that we're all very familiar with at this point, and that's the Viheimer deck. We decided to choose our own for obvious reasons, but same old deck, no changes really. We have toyed around with certain tech cards depending on what we're seeing. So a card that we've experimented with to differing levels of success has been Concussive Palm. But other than that, same old stuff. Solitary Monk, just a very solid card to break through in that mid game, that early mid game. Um, Heimerdinger, obviously, crazy interactions with the deck in terms of value and tempo. Will is a 3 of a must at this point. Deny, I think when we talk about where this deck can be modified, it's definitely that deny spot. The current meta really isn't allowing for deny to be a very playable card, considering that it's a lot of tempo, meaning units, and then a lot of burst spells to augment those. So deny is now doesn't really have a place to see play at the moment. It's not hard countering those big slow spells like a Ruination in the past, or a card that we haven't seen forever in Harrowing. But in general, same old stuff. Get excited, Mystic Shots. There's just not a whole lot to say about this deck. It's generally the best deck, but if you're seeing a lot of aggro, especially a deck we're going to talk about in a bit, this heavy Shadow Isles aggro deck, then it's harder to play Heimerdinger. But if you're fine with taking those punches, then I think you should be sticking with Heimerdinger, and that's why it's going to be our first S tier deck.
I might want to zoom in a little bit here.
You want to zoom in a little bit?
Yeah. Okay. Just see this list a little bit better. Sorry, I probably should have brought that up already, but hey, you can see it, I guess, reasonably well. I guess one of the we can definitely cover some reasons why, though, that I think that this deck went from. I mean, this deck was seeming like still the best deck before patch 1.2, but it clearly wasn't as dominant as it was or as it is now before patch 1.2. The biggest difference for sure is there's the burn matchup of what I was just saying earlier, of because the game is so matchup dependent. It's like in a vacuum, this is the best deck, just has best matchups across the board. There's just so many ways that this deck can win that even when your opponent even when it feels like your opponent is winning the game, you can end up just curving your win rate to an exceedingly high percentage just because of it has the ability to win from such losing positions against just any deck. Heimerdinger is just such a ridiculous card in the fact of how many unblockable cards that it can create. But that burn matchup was just impossible, and now that there's significantly less of it, the win rate is kind of just through the roof on this deck. That also being said, the Chempunk though versus Claws the Dragon, as well as the Deny, I think are the two main deck choice differences. Of we played Chempunk and Key Guardian before patch 1.2, and I don't think much changed about those. But what Matt was saying with the Deny of just there's just not really anything to use it against. All the spells have just turned to burst. There's a ton of like Sej MF. That deck doesn't really play anything that you can use it against. Lux Karma is pretty much gone, and one of the best uses for Deny was just to beat the opposing Ionia spells. Just beat Will of Ionia, beat Deny, and Corina Control is the other one. Like in the Corina Control is just completely dropped out of the meta for the most part. Almost nobody plays that deck anymore. The last one that I would say that Deny was pretty good against was Deep, but because you just have such a ridiculously favored matchup against it, you really just don't need to be playing two copies of Deny anymore. You can just play the one copy for, that one turn where you can get a really heavy Deny off and just deny anything that could stop you from winning the game that turn. But just with Deep Meditation, it doesn't really, you just don't need to play that many copies and have that many brick cards in your hand. The Concussive Bomb has been testing pretty well. I think, again, because we're just leaning a lot more towards a more aggressive format, that it's definitely a lot better than it used to be. I don't think we're seeing the decks don't seem to be all over the place anymore. There's not really a whole lot of top end decks. There's not really a whole lot of even mid rangey decks. It's mostly just aggressive decks and decks with overstated units. Those are all of them. So I think that's definitely why we see this deck moving up.
Talked the life out of Heimer in the past. So
yeah, probably just
we're gonna transition to a deck that our latest deck profile has been on, and that is the Ezreal Karma. Very classic deck, especially if you think about the beginning of the game, how it's just these two cards are very synergistic. Still playing Eyes. One Yone just to get those targets in. He can also be nice for sometimes if the game is just not dictating a Ezreal and Karma lethal, you can Yone if they have a very tall board and go wide on that turn. One Jury Rig just to... This card is almost like a leftover from a prior format, so maybe Jury Rig isn't as important, but it is nice, especially with these unit-based aggression decks, to just have a cheap blocker and buy yourself another turn where you can turn the corner with an Ezreal. But other than that, same Chump Wump Rummage value. Static Shock is going to be a 3 of in this deck until the end of time. It's the best activator for Ezreal in this deck. 3 Will, because we've seen a lot of Deep, and not only if there wasn't Deep, it's just an incredibly powerful tool to have access to. It's one of the best reasons to play Ionia. If you notice, there actually is not a deny in this deck. I think that is a good choice for patch 1.2, considering the lack of targets and matchups where that card is important. 3 Concussive Palm, just a nice tool to have when they're going wide with units. Still playing Deep Met despite the nerf. It's still just a great value card to be using. And yeah, pretty much just the same deck. I guess a difference would be Get Excited over Gotcha. I think the reach for Get Excited is too valuable to ever give up. Our deck already generates some good pitch cards in the form of the Mushroom Clouds, so that shouldn't really be an issue. And decks that have reach, especially Piltover and Zaun, is the greatest ability with reach because of Mystic Shot and Get Excited, that you want to utilize those, and it gives your deck a clear advantage over decks that don't have access to those. It lets you play in a different way. It lets you construct lethals in games that you should probably lose, and therefore your deck is less linear. But yeah, this deck is pretty much the same from the patch prior.
I would say, I guess some big points though on this of just as you brought up the deny, and like we're just seeing so few spells that we can actually counter anymore. And with a deck like this, one of the main reasons why we don't play Claws of the Dragon, and a lot of people have been asking, is that card just it's so low value. Like one of the main problems with Ezreal right now is just running out of cards in hand. As long as you have cards in hand, once you reach the end game, you will kill your opponent, but that's not always easy. You're running your cards a lot of time, trying to just go 1-for-1 on a lot of things and trying to take any card advantage where you can get it. But playing cards like Claws of the Dragon, you kind of just inefficiently trade with a lot of things. And even when you do trade, you're just depleting cards in your hand without doing one of two things, which is A, the card doesn't target, so you're not progressing your Ezreal at all. And B, once you get to your Ezreal, that card doesn't actually help you win the game. Whereas if you look at this list, 37 out of 40 cards either interact with Ezreal as being a spell or get you towards leveling it. And so like it's some part of the win condition of the deck. Eye of the Dragon is the only part that has basically nothing to do with the win condition, but that 2 healing it off of the Dragonlings, as well as that pushing a little bit of extra damage, will help you stabilize towards the end game, will help you, it does indirectly contribute to your win condition by giving you a little bit of extra chip damage, which is very important, and being able to sustain your way through the game. And that's kind of I think that's just something big to say about this deck, because it's the most common question in any Ionia deck that we post. People will always just say, why do you not think Claws of the Dragon is good? And at least outside of Heimer, not as many people have agreed with us on that one. But a lot of top players are not playing Claws of the Dragon in their deck right now, at least in as Karma, and definitely see the value loss on that card for sure. Any thoughts on Lux Heimer? It's just a really inferior version of the Heimer Vi deck. It offers nothing additional really, outside of like, it seems to be that you might have a little bit better sustain through the mid game against the more aggressive decks, I would say. But then you have it's so much harder to win the game once you get there. And Pencar, we're doing a meta review, doing the podcast here. We're going to be doing this every Sunday, kind of going over the top decks of the format, why some changes are going on, and just talking about everything Runeterra. And Pre-Star, you are weird. This is the 5th day that we've seen this. Can you elaborate on why your Lux Karma and Freljord Elusives by Heimer lists are running to deny, whereas Ez Karma and Noxus Elusives don't run any? I understand that Noxus Elusives is very fast and that Ez Karma prefers spells that level Ez, but I would expect to see your other list drop to 1 or 0 deny given your comments. So yeah, the Heimer list actually is supposed to have 1 deny. It got updated and then it didn't. I can actually change that right now. It's supposed to be 1 deny and 1 concussive palm right now. Yeah, okay, yeah. The one that we just popped up on screen was the original list that we had. It was also more for the discussion points though of that's the more common deck, I think is, yeah, actually that's why we changed it back earlier. But currently the list is 1 concussive palm is what I would play. But what people are commonly playing is they've either net decked our old list with the double Chempunk, double Keyguard, or one Key Guardian, or they cut those 3 cards and play 3 Claws. But almost everyone is still on 2 Denies, 2 Spirit Refuge. So as for what
I
to
also
expect, that
I
would
don't think that they're comparable because as Karma is really tight on space. There are so many cards that
that
are
also, yeah,
good
for sure.
that you don't play in that deck because of space purposes.
As for, yeah, so for Viheimer, it makes a little more sense because you're trying to protect your plays where you're actually trying to win the game. So it does make a lot of sense to actually play one copy in that deck still, and I would definitely never cut it from the deck entirely because your deck has turns where given one response to your opponent's one outer, such as Withering Wail or certain things of that nature, you'll win the game. And Heimer's all about just navigating your way to dealing 20 damage to your opponent. In a deck like as Karma, though, it's like you need all of your cards to actually interact with the board. And Deny is a card that can just brick in your hand. It's not going to really advance your Ezreal's win condition. And a lot of times, most of the big spells, like there's nothing that you're really truly afraid of in that deck. Like there's nothing super scary at all for that deck that you're like really hoping to play Deny on. Lux Karma is definitely just a far more controlling deck that you would probably want to still be playing a Deny in, and just as a deck that's supposed to just be a jack of all trades and have all the responses. For Elusives, it's kind of the same thing as Heimer. As long as you have something like that in your hand, your very powerful board states can not be interacted with, and you'll be able to push for a game a lot more easily. Is there a link for the overview to all of your decks? Yes. If you type !decks in chat, you can see all of the decks with their tiers as well. Every deck that we're going to be going over on stream is right at that link. You play MF Sedge like an aggro deck? Yes, generally it is an aggressive kind of damage deck.
The way that I see a lot of those Sejuani decks is it's very similar to Demacia. You just play your units on curve and attack.
Yeah, I would say they're definitely very straightforward.
Right, and here's a deck that I don't know if a lot of people would say is S tier. If you look at the Mobalytics ratings, though, in terms of win percentage, this deck in Master has, well, does it not? It used to. Oh no, it does. There it is. This deck has the highest win rate right now, so it's pretty hard to ignore, and it's quite good actually. It's not just a flash in the pan. I think I think that there's a lot of variations of this deck. This Indoor Atrocity with this very aggressive early game. So this deck in particular is the one that I took from the Mobalytic stats. It plays the Callista. Callista's nice, but I do think it can hinder the way that you actually get to where you want sometimes, and that's why I would probably prefer even Elise maybe just as like a better card to curve with, or maybe you can figure out how to play both. But yeah, just this very strong start. Bark Beast, Curse Keeper, Ravenous Butcher, best opener in the game. You refill some of your resources with the Sentry. Blighted Caretaker, a card that hasn't seen as much play as we thought it did, or
not enough
rather.
Play at all. That card is ridiculous, and
right.
It's kind of crazy that it's only been seeing a lot of play recently in this deck.
Right, it took so long for this card to see a lot of play, but yeah, just an insane in terms of tempo on turn 3, especially if you have the attack. Even on 4, if you have to underdrop, it's still incredibly powerful. Neverglade Collector, a card that people thought was strong, but didn't really know where it would line up in terms of the meta. But I think this is a perfect deck for it. It might even be overpowered in this deck. It's really, really great. They Who Endure, just so effortlessly synergistic with the deck. You're killing your own guys a lot. You're going face a lot, especially the Callista. You're reviving a guy who dies every turn. An Overwhelm, huge stat stick, especially with the Atrocity, gives your deck reach that Shadow Isles never had before outside of Ladros Atrocity, so that it just really solidifies this deck as an all-around powerhouse. And then spells, just the common SI ones. Glimpse, obviously still great. Vile Feast, and then Fury the North. This card is really, really, really good. I think it might have been undervalued in certain ways when the game was first shaping up in terms of the meta, but has really found a spot, and even in these very strong mono decks has really proved itself as worthy of splashing. If your one splash would be Frey, I think Fury of the North is definitely worthy of that position. And then this version plays Haunted Relic, obviously for the Callista synergy, but it's also nice with the They Who Endure, the Blighted Caretaker. It's a target for the Butcher even.
Yeah, the Neverglade Collector too. Like, it's a lot of reach
Right.
for the deck, and like Neverglade Collector adding all that reach and even sustain against the decks that are kind of burning you out is like it does so much for the deck, just very effortlessly. When you just have no other fives, you have no other sixes, and your board's kind of already established. It like the whole point of the deck is to make a ridiculous board state in the early game, and then just finish them off with just a few cards once to really capitalize on that board state of just Neverglade Collector, getting extra value out of all these shitty cards once you hit that stage of the game. They Who Endure, pretty obvious of just giant overwhelm, and then Atrocity. So I don't think there's really anything to be said about the late game of this deck. They're all just very, very nice finishers. I will say that I go back and forth on Callista in the deck. It just kind of seems like there's not much more you can do with that deck slot, but it does always feel like it slows you down a bit when you end up playing her. It's just that there's just not a whole lot more you can do with the deck. I do really like the Wraithcaller builds. The Champless Wraithcaller builds seem to be better in my opinion, and I think it makes your Heimerdinger matchup a lot better too, which that deck, if you don't get a fast enough start, you generally lose every time. But with a very strong start, it's very easy to win. I would say, generally speaking, that the matchup for Heimerdinger can be one of the tougher ones if you play something like Wraithcaller and just keep rolling your way through on the board. Because going wide on the board against Heimerdinger is usually how you end up beating them, unless you just put the clock on them so fast on a board that they can't really deal with before they start to pop off. So the reason why Vlad Sedge has such a high win rate, and it's not an S tier by anyone. Those win rates are definitely not the only thing to be looking at. There's always reasoning behind win rates that are not always very obvious. I would say I would take anything off of any of the meta stats in the leaderboards as well, off of what is it? Mobalytics with a grain of salt. Also, I don't believe that's in Master, right? That's not the like in Master. I don't think it has that insane of a win rate. BB was probably the deep is the best deck in the game right now. I strongly disagree. That deck gets absolutely shit on by Heimerdinger. Cannot be the best deck.
Yeah, I think that with Ionia being there's two variations of Ionia that are S tier out of the four S tier that we consider decks, that it would be very hard to call that deck S tier. It's strong. Right. It doesn't have like that many bad matchups outside of Ionia, and it can even curve very well into an Ionia matchup, but I do think that it's still on that tweener stage in between S and A. But another thing to note about this deck, like Nick mentioned before, is there is a Mistwraith version of this deck that it just uses that very powerful Mistwraith shell, and pretty much everything else is the same. Some decks even play other packages, like a stronger Drain package. We've seen Withering Wail or Grass played, or that would be probably the deck where you would play those cards, just because you're trying to limit the amount of Frey cards, off-color cards in general. But also worth noting that is a very strong deck. But yeah, Endure Spiders definitely coming, or I guess it's not even Spiders, it's just Endure Shadow Isles, very strong. And then our last S tier deck, where is the MF Sejuani, and everybody has seen this a ton recently. And I think it's because of the linear play, and that's not to shit on the deck, but I do think
this
new
deck, Demacia. It's 100%
right. This deck reminds me so much of that classic Demacia. Just you play your big dudes and you hit them in the face. But this deck is augmented by the fact that it has these Plunder, Yoink, Klepto, whatever you want to call these cards, and that not only is that value in terms of like you run out of steam, but it really disrupts what your opponent's trying to do, and especially in control matchups where this strategy of just smash mouth big guys might not work as well. You're disrupting what they're trying to do by fudging their deck up. Also, another card that really stops control decks is Riptide Rex. when
Oh,
they're
this card is
trying to.
ridiculous. I
This
think this is
card's
one of the main reasons
ridiculous,
why this card is, or why this
especially
deck
in
is doing so well right now.
right. It just this card's almost like a champion in terms of power level. Turn
I would say
8,
it's
you're
better than most of the champions in the game right now, actually.
oh for
This card
sure.
is absolutely absurd, for sure.
Right, especially with Warning Shot and just this deck goes wide, so if it even it's usually better to play the Riptide Rex before combat because obviously you would want to attack with it, but there are many situations in which you could play it after combat. It's just it creates a lot of damned if you do, damned if you don't situations. You don't want to develop your board because it gets destroyed by the Riptide Rex, but at the same time you take a bunch of face damage at either way. Very, very hard card to play around. You can't negate the ability, obviously, because it's in the form, it's the best form possible in increments of 1, so they are set on a stack. There will be 7 different cannon barrages, all with different targets. Very hard to prevent. But yeah, just this deck in general is incredibly powerful compared to even past Demacia decks, which relied around pure stats. This deck has different facets that make it more annoying.
There's definitely some other parts about this deck that are questionable, I think, from the decisions of the people that play it. So, a lot of people don't play Citrus Courier. I often just don't see this in people's lists. I have no idea why. This card is so powerful in this deck, and a lot of these lists just don't even run it. Um, Probably don't need more than one. One's probably the right number. I could see maybe 2 copies of that card, but space is a little tight. The other one that I go back and forth on, and we talked about it a lot, is like if 3 warning shots is really necessary in this deck. And sometimes it feels like yes, and then other times it feels like it's a little too shitty on value in the hands where you just don't draw the powerful plunder cards with it. But obviously that's the point of it, and there's a good amount of them in your deck that it feels warranted. But you do play Yordle Grifter. Is another big we've talked about it a lot of like if you would consider playing less warning shots because you play 3 Yordle Grifters in the deck, just generating a warning shot guaranteed even without the allegiance. But this deck definitely seems like what Matt was saying of the whatever you want to call them, the steel cards that can draw cards out of your opponent's deck, just have such strong counterplay against a few things that are popular right now. One of them being the decks that self-buff a little bit, like we have Ashe Sejuani, like even Omen Hawks just floating around in other Freljord decks. And also the fact that what he said about the controlling decks, I think a great example is Heimerdinger of typically Heimerdinger actually has a pretty good matchup against this deck because they have such low interaction. The only thing that you're truly worried about is the cards like Citrus Courier and Riptide Rex because they can kind of just it essentially feels like your opponent is taking well over 1 turn with the deck. Like when they play Riptide Rex or Citrus Courier, they just do way more than 1 turn should be capable of doing in a deck like this. But the steel cards give you a way to make your opponent play a lot slower in decks like that, in decks like as Karma as well, and other slower decks by just like one of the reasons why this deck usually isn't that hard for Heimer is because they have no interaction. There's really not a lot of ways for them to combat what I'm doing other than playing a Make It Rain on turrets that were just generated for free. So it's not even usually that punishing. They have no way to kill Heimerdinger in the deck reliably other than Riptide Rex, which doesn't come down until turn 8. But if they start stealing your cards early enough in the game, it just adds now, even if you didn't steal my 3 damage cards that can kill my Heimerdinger off, I have to play accordingly. Generally, I have to try to evaluate on the board, can I play safe here and play around my Heimerdinger dying? Because if Heimerdinger dies against this deck, a lot of times you're screwed, but that only happens when they steal your cards. And sometimes they're just far enough ahead on board that normally, like, you just have to play the Heimerdinger. And normally, when they didn't steal cards from your deck, you should now be winning that game because your Heimerdinger is going to live guaranteed against this deck, and you start turning the game around and start crushing them. But sometimes they steal exactly the cards that ended up beating your deck. And that's just such a powerful dynamic to a deck that already has a consistent way to just push damage and win the game. And if you can even just slow your opponent down by the fear of having those cards, that has an extremely beneficial effect for a deck like this, as opposed to a lot of the other decks that steal your cards are a little bit slower. The older lists that we used to see, like TF Karma and those types of steel decks that just didn't really capitalize in the mid game on those cards and getting the tempo swing, as well as cards like Riptide Rex. This card probably abuses Riptide Rex more than any other deck that can play it for the most part, because you're already usually ahead on board when you play something like this, and it's just lights out when he comes down. Like your opponent starts to turn the corner in the late game, and then you just beat them. So it counters some very popular strategies right now, such as Heimerdinger. It's one of the best ways to deal with that deck of just getting the Riptide Rex on turn 8. a lot of times that can just kill their Heimer and there's nothing they can really do about it. So so
Yeah,
against
this
other aggro decks, like you just win the board every time with that card.
Yeah, I think this deck is. I think like we said, it reminds us of a Demacia deck. I also that's a reason why I understand why it's being played so much. That very linear style is very accessible to players. We saw that Lux Karma was also that way, where it wasn't too linear that it's like you're playing the same shit every game, but at the same time, it's also just like very straightforward in its path to victory. um, and that deck got the axe with patch 1.2. Not completely, and I'm sure we'll talk about it in that B tier. But this deck is now, that very accessible, straightforward deck to be playing. So you're going to see it a lot, and it doesn't have bad matchups. So I think until something changes drastically, we're not really going to see this deck getting anywhere close to obscurity.
How did Ez Karma do for you guys? It's been doing really well. I think
We
it's
actually went
definitely an S
undefeated.
tier deck, one of the best. Yeah, we didn't lose a game the other night when I started playing it, so there was just a little too many burn decks and they who endures with the Wraith Caller packages of just like those are kind of the two bad matchups for Heimer right now. And the Endure one's not even that bad of a matchup. It's just when they perfect curve, you can't really do anything about it. You definitely can though, something like Ezreal. Um, yeah, I think the Pilfered Goods and the Grifter, though, to answer your question, John, is of like I don't think there's really that much better. Like you can make the deck a little more aggressive, but I feel like you lose out a lot in the matchups where like Heimerdinger of like those cards are just so important in decks like in matchups like that of just being able to steal their cards and make them play differently just based off of the possibilities of what can come out, and you can just capitalize on the kind of the psychological impact of it of how your opponent is forced to
Right.
play.
And then I would say that Klepto, particularly with Heimer, because of how you're supposed to play that deck very defensively, especially affects that strategy, and it punishes you for playing better because the better player will they will respect those outs. And with the Klepto, you don't know what they are, but you still feel inclined to respect them. So it creates this a very awkward gameplay where it's like, well, I got to take a shot in the dark. I either get screwed or I don't. But it's obviously not very conducive to what the good Heimer player is trying to do. Um,
Space Bear. So if you're ever looking at the win rates of decks, never look at all ranks. It's completely useless data for the most
yeah.
part, unless if you're specifically not playing in Master and you're curious what a lot of people around you are playing because you specifically want to counter queue and get up to Master, then sure you can do that. But like that data is just, and it's part of the reason of why some of these win rates aren't even 100% accurate for in Masters, because decks like Heimer Vi, until people kind of learned how to play it, the win rate wasn't as high as it should have been because so many people in Masters just couldn't play the deck properly. And we saw it time and time again on stream. We mirror match these people all the time, and they've just made absurd misplays. Even the streamers that were, like supposedly some of the better players, it's just because you can tell they're inexperienced. They make plays that are good based off of regular Legends of Runeterra logic, but they don't know the deck exactly. Also, I would say that the deck doesn't go deep any faster. There, 0 cards have been added to the deck that allow your deck to go deep faster. The cards that are anti-aggro cards were just swapped out for other cards that do similar things, and they're a little more unit based now. But like there's nothing got added to the deck to make you go deep faster. Also,
Yeah.
the deck going deep does not mean that you basically can't lose. It's quite the contrary. A lot of times you actually do lose the game while you're deep. I mean, Heimerdinger absolutely obliterates that deck. It doesn't even matter when they go deep. If they go
Yeah.
deep on like turn 5 or 6 because they just drew the nuts, I mean, like, sure, you should win those games against most decks, but it's not really the way to go. I started to play Freljord since the sample size will have more trustworthy stats. Again, it's like you have to look at Masters, and even in Masters, there's a lot of bad players in Masters. So you have to take some of these percentages with a grain of salt and understand too of the decks that are not as hard to pilot. I would say that the win rates are going to be more true to what is represented. In the decks that are much harder to play, the win rates should be higher because in the hands of the best players in the game, those win rates are much higher. Across the board. Like if you look at decks like
Also,
Ez Karma and decks like Heimer, the best player in the game, or sorry, the best player in Master versus the worst player in Master, those win rates are absurdly different. Whereas decks like Demacia and MF Sej, those win rates really aren't that much different. They're obviously higher for the better player, no doubt, but It's you can only push a win rate so hard in decks that don't have a ton of decisions to be made.
Also, just something to note with the matches played, they vary a lot based on depending on how they segment them. So like, as you can see, there's many versions of Heimer Vi on this list, despite them being very similar in content. But also, just some of these newer decks, they don't get the reps seen if you're not using Mobalytics, or even Mobalytics themselves filters out the matches through different ways. So just because you don't see like a lot of matches played on this side doesn't mean necessarily that it's not being played, because obviously I think we've seen this Shadow Isles deck not only just played recently a lot, but just played a lot period throughout the game's history. So I think the play rate and the matches played are not indicative of that.
Oh, right on time.
We were just going to talk about your deck.
Oh, just got home.
Wow, that it really just couldn't have been more perfectly timed. We were just discussing Deep, and although I do believe it got better, I was just disagreeing with the points made about why it is better and why it should be compared to something like Heimer Vibe, but
yeah,
I do believe that deck got much better based on the meta shift more so.
Yes.
It is the first deck that I wanted to get to, because I feel like there is a significant drop off between that deck and where the next tier, where we're talking about an A tier.
That looks good right there. Oh, back.
No, it's
right there.
fine.
Yeah, there we go. Beautiful. I know that design discussion is a little off topic, but I'd quite like to see both Yoink and Rex rework. Yeah, those are two of the by far the most problematic cards in all of.
Yeah, we could talk
probably
about
the only ones I think that are problematic.
We could definitely talk about some reworks at the end. We just wanted to get through the meat right here. We wanted to talk about the meta itself and the decks that comprise of it. So we wanted to get that first, but we could definitely talk about what we feel could be changes for a potential patch 1.3, which should be coming out this week, right? I think this
is this week or next week?
Right?
I think it's this
we didn't, yeah, because there's no update this week, right?
Well, there was the
this previous week there wasn't an update,
right?
Which means we should be getting one.
But I think
it's not a balance change.
Every 2 weeks,
just,
right?
No, balance change is once a month. But we do get an update to the game every.
I thought it was every. Maybe you're right.
I kind of forget actually.
I thought it was 1 week on, 1 week off with content and maintenance, but I could be misinformed. But we're gonna talk about sea monsters now because of the subject of, is this deck an S tier deck? A lot of people, and definitely based on if you looked at the play rate of this deck, which is incredibly high, I would say yes, it's an S tier deck. But I think we have to make the distinction between those top 4 decks and then sea monsters, because this deck is not on the same level. It's also incredibly counterable by half of those decks just with one card. So I think that this really does separate in terms of tier. But this deck is very good, to not to speak of it too poorly.
I think it beats all the other A tier decks. I think this is probably sitting at the top of A tier, if I had to say, and it's pushing towards S tier, but it's just falling short on the linear gameplay and the substantial holes specifically versus the S tier strategies, rather than
things that it just cannot overcome even through good play.
Right, and main one being Heimerdinger. I think it's just like a deck that it's ridiculous how slanted that matchup. It is absurd. Like, there are very few matchups in Runeterra that are as unwinnable as that one, and that's probably that might be like that has to be the number one reason why I personally put this deck in A tier. It's just that matchup is brutal. This is like just.
I think it's just the prominence of every deck that plays Ionia plays 3 Will of Ionia, so that just makes this deck very hard to call an S tier deck. But we can still go through it. Hired Gun is a change that we made. We really just weren't a fan of Dredgers. It was more of a necessity rather than a good card back when Noxus Piltover was half the ladder and that deck was incredibly strong. But Hired Gun, even in retrospect, Hired Gun might be a better card just because it's able to pick apart those pesky boards Just
Oh,
like
sorry,
a
you
real...
meant Thorny Toad for reference.
Thorny
Toad,
Toad.
Yeah,
not
yeah, yeah.
Dredgers, yes.
I got a little confused myself. So you're like, so Dredgers
Yeah.
was not a
No,
great
no,
card. I'm
no.
like, oh, that's the best card in the year.
No, no, no.
Okay, yeah,
Dredgers is
yeah,
this
okay,
card.
yeah.
You definitely want
Thorny
this card.
Toad was pretty
Yeah,
awful, and like
excuse
you
me.
said, it was just a necessity due to the burn decks for sure, and even Demacia a bit.
Yes.
Right. So hired gun, not only because of its comparable in early game usage, but just in the late game, this card is very useful, especially when constructing lethals. You have a, let's say your opponent has like a very tall card with life steal. So let's think of like a Radiant Guardian. You can hired gun, pull it to the back and go through. You could pull anything really and put it in the back. But even if you just need to like kill a very annoying elusive creature, or excuse me, unit, hired gun helps you with that. Hired gun is just a very versatile card and doesn't fall flat in the end game like a card that like a Thorny Toad would. A card that still perplexes me that people are questioning how good this card is Jaw Hunters. This card is fantastic. It creates value. Even if this card was to fail, it replaces itself, which is incredible. And not just replaces itself with a random card, but a random sea monster, which is a very limited pool and obviously very conducive to this deck. I just don't understand how people don't see that. Wanderers, still, solid card. This deck plays Beast Below. I think Beast Below is more solid
How have
than...
you been feeling about that, Anton? You've been playing this deck a lot more than any of us have. I know you've been testing out the different builds and all that. So, how have you been feeling about the Beast?
I think the Beast Pillow is definitely trimmable. I think that with the hired guns, it gives you some nice options early on to be able to kill like Maokai's and other 4 health things if you can get certain things to line up. But a lot of things have to line up for that to happen on curve really well. I do still maybe like having this as a one of, though we've discussed one ofs in these lists are pretty janky, though. Even if it's a sea monster that you can shuffle back in, it's not too horrible. But yeah, it's something that I think that you could potentially have other cards in its slot, but it doesn't feel terrible either. It's just one of those flex things where it's just kind of like, what are you seeing more of? It could be like a Withering Wail, it could be Grasp if you need heal, it could be a Vile Feast, it could be things like that. Just kind of depends on what you're queuing into a lot, but it's not a terrible card. Yeah.
I do think this is in that flex spot for sure. Abyssal Eye, you can definitely you can play around with the numbers. Some play 2, some play 3, but I think this is one of the stronger sea monsters just by virtue of having that elusive. You can play a 6/6 elusive that draws a card in the end game for cheap. That's very strong. Devour the Depths, probably the strongest of the sea monsters. Just an incredible
I always
effect.
go back and forth between those two. They're both those two are definitely the powerhouse players in the deck, especially for the mana cost too. It's like that what the card does for the mana cost is kind of not really, it's
Right, and
incomparable
especially
to the
if
rest
you
of the
think
sea
of
monsters.
that end game where you have your flipped Nautilus and these guys are cheap, Devour and Abyssal Eye just create boards, and I think Devour gets the edge for me because of its counterplay to some strategies that you may not otherwise be able to combat, something like an Unyielding Spirits that isn't as popular as it was in the beginning of the expansion, but still something that this deck obviously can't play around otherwise. The Obliterate mechanic itself is just very good for last breaths in general, or cards that otherwise wouldn't be able to be killed. So I just think this card is a must 3 of, while Abyssal Eye could be a 2 depending on how you see it, but still probably a 3 of. Shipwreck Quarter and Terror of the Tides, 2 just late game techs. They're just one ofs. Obviously, if you mill them, it's not a big deal. Nautilus will shuffle them back in. But just 2 strong cards, especially I'm a fan of the Terror of the Tides. Part of the hard part and why Abyssal Eye is better is that these cards generally can just get chump blocked. If you're not aware of chump block, you just put a cheap unit in front of it to mitigate the damage. But Terror of the Tides stops that completely by giving your whole sea monsters fearsome and then nagging the board the 2 attack to make the fearsome even more strong. It essentially makes the fearsome to 4 or lower that can't block it. So that's great. And then I think we talked about Jettison in the previews. We said that this card will be powerful depending on how important toss is. We see that power tossing, getting to toss very quickly in a lot of strategies and matchups is very important. Therefore, Jettison is a must of 3. Miscall, you're summoning a lot of high value units. They die, you summon a cheap one for 3 mana. Pretty self-explanatory. This card is also in that flex consideration, but I like it. Salvage, also just nothing to be said about Salvage. Atrocity is a must-have for this deck. You need that reach. You need that reach in the same way that Terror of the Tides gives you a little bit of reach, but you play Nautilus, you attack, and then Atrocity gives you the ability to lethal, where this deck can fall flat when it doesn't have that reach. And we talk about reach a lot and its importance because of the way you can play. Let's say you're losing a game, you can Nautilus and attack. Let's say their board isn't even able to block it, but they have lethal on you with elusive guys. You can just attack Atrocity and win. And then this deck plays 3 Vengeance in the spot where you would play Grasp and Whale. Vengeance is, this deck loses to a lot of strong champion decks. Vengeance, we felt, was very powerful for this deck. Especially for if you were playing something in a limited format like Tournament, Vengeance is what you want to be targeting, those strong champion-based decks and strategies with. And
Heimer's also our worst matchup. It's one of the best ways to get rid of him.
Yes,
Right,
I think
Heimer.
that is definitely... Vengeance is actually, like, there's a common misconception from playing so much Heimer. Vengeance is 1,000 times scarier than Withering Wail against Heimer, and a lot of people think that it's like, oh, we need Wail against the Heimer deck. If you've seen us play the deck a lot of times, I'll let you kill all my turrets and then still beat you because they were just free cards. And, like, you're investing your whole turn. It's not going to... Like, you have to kill the Heimerdinger. If I keep protecting my Heimerdinger, you will not win the game. Like, Withering Wail can just buy you a turn to then proceed your inevitable death. Unless... Like, sometimes it buys you a turn, and then you have to kill me, like, right then and there, and there's a good chance I can stop you. Like, it only takes 1 Will of Ione to stop you from winning the game, or 1 Deny a lot of the time. Like, it really just doesn't take much. It just doesn't do a lot. Vengeance, though, especially because I think the better Heimer players will start to realize that you don't want 2 Denies in the deck. Like Anton said, this is the best tool to kill it. And it's
Right.
so hard to play around. I have to wait for 4 mana as opposed to 3 mana open to play the Heimerdinger now. And I need a Deny, which I'm only playing 1 copy of. So I'm just not going to. I've begun to just disrespect Vengeance majority of the time now when playing against this deck. You can just play around it a bit by, like, vomiting onto your board a bit as best you can and trying to win off of that. But it's not a card that you can reasonably be playing around. So having 3 copies against that deck is probably your best chance of winning. Even in the mirror.
Yeah, it's
I mean,
also a
I've been
great
liking it in
card
the
versus the
mirror.
mirror. Being able
Yeah.
to answer Nautilus is so important, especially if they go deep before you. It's also great against, say, like, Endure Spiders, being able to just have a really good answer to the They Who Endure. It's good against the Sejuani decks because it's a really nice answer to Sejuani. And you're just kind of, with this deck, you're just kind of curving out. Like, if you look at our mana base on our creatures, I mean, we have like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and you want to curve out. You just want to hit a guy every turn. But once you kind of top out at that 5 or 6 range, then it's just about fighting for board, and that's when your vengeances start being active, and you're able to kill anything that they're able to play on the board that's bigger than the board that you've already been able to develop, and just press your advantage further until you get deep, and then all of your guys get bigger than anything that they can handle, and then that's how you kind of take the game away.
Yeah, Ruination is definitely a card to bring up. A lot of people think that card is like really good in this. That is a tournament strategy. That is not good on ladder, like 100%. And like there's a strong difference between like knowing which deck you're going to be playing against and where that card is so strong in specific lineups, specifically, not even just deep. Your lineup has to be constructed around the understanding that Ruination is in your deep deck to play around certain holes in the lineup overall. And seeing what decks are going to be playing against. But yeah, exactly what Fatsumo said. It's literally just, this is a board-centric deck. You dump like so many powerful units onto the board, and then you're going to blow up your own board. Like, my board is better than yours. Like,
Right.
the amount of times I've seen Anton play this deck, and I'm like, your opponent's board is not ever better than yours. That's not, like, this is never the case once you get to that stage of the game. So I should say once you get to that stage of the game, where you're playing a Ruination. But as we start
Right.
turning the corner, and it's like, it's only good in bad scenarios where, like, you just got shit on the whole game, like, and
Right.
like you've just like you didn't draw any toss, you didn't draw any reasonable units, anything like it's just people don't play around
going
Ruination
real
on ladder
awful
anyway.
for you.
I mean,
Yeah.
Yeah.
True, but like you could just play a board instead. And
I agree.
so
People
I
are
guess-
not playing around Ruination right now.
I think
Right.
it's very important to make a point where you see tournament results, you see DRR, and you want to play those decks on ladder. Don't do that. Those decks are intended for the right purpose and the right context. So a deck we saw a ton of this week to varying degrees of success, usually not so successful, is Ashe Sejuani. That Noxus deck. It's not that deck is not meant for ladder. Yes, it has like an okay win rate. You're probably going about 50-50, but that deck is for a context. Don't try to extrapolate that to ladder. You're going to be disappointed with the results.
It definitely can work. It's not like Ruination will never work. Like it has been played in ladder, and I'm sure there are times when it'll be good. But I think over a very large sample size of games, you will find that there is a better card that's just more consistent and more conducive to your entire game plan. It's like it's very corner case scenarios. Also, as Anton said earlier, one-ofs in this deck are bad. Like it's just very hard to consistently draw one-ofs in this deck. And also,
And
like
in general.
And you
yeah,
toss
I mean, yeah,
them
they're bad
and-
in most
yeah.
decks, but like especially this deck, it's
right,
not.
there is a point to be made that yes, tosses from the bottom of your deck, but Nautilus shuffles your deck. Therefore,
Right.
if you have one-ofs, and they're at the bottom, it shuffles your deck. It changes the contents of the order. Therefore, you just don't want to be playing one-of in general unless you had a reason. And this deck doesn't have tutors or even much draw anyway, so you really
Right.
don't
The biggest
want
problem
to
with this is it's a reactive one of too. It's not a proactive one of. It's a completely reactive one of. So like it's
Right.
only good in a reactive situation. It's not just always good.
You're inconsistently drawing it for an inconsistent scenario. It's just you're doubling down on a card like often and
not
just
working
not
out
being
the way
good.
you want it. And Vengeance,
Exactly.
people are intimidated or turned off by Vengeance's high cost, but I think people are undervaluing that outside of Ionia, there's no way to stop killing a unit in this game, or I guess we do in Unyielding Spirit, but there's just not a lot of ways to counter straight up kill a unit, while decks have pseudo ways to like increase the health or stats of a unit. There's no way to stop kill a unit, so I think that's something to value.
Like you guys address not playing or not including Vile Feast in this list. It's really like it's still a strong card. Don't get me wrong. And we also said it's in the flex slot of the Beast Below slot. It kind of just depends on what you're seeing on ladder. But like against a lot of the decks that Vile Feast. Okay, so first of all, there's like really not. There's very little Noxus built over. And then once we've seen the elusive Noxus deck start to come back into play, or just elusive decks in general, Vile Feast starts to feel like it's a bit better. But like against the MF Sej deck, that card doesn't actually do like that much. Like most of the time, a 4/4 is just a little more effective against a lot of their board states. It's really not that good versus Heimer. I mean, it kills like a turret, so that's not really helpful there. As Karma, it's not really helpful there. Like it's not like exceedingly powerful. It's just a consistently like all right card. But I think the elusive decks is probably like the main reason why it would be like take out Beast Below, put that back in, because our MF Sej matchup is usually pretty good already.
Right.
And then maybe just combat the elusive cards a bit more so you have a little more answers. It's definitely a strong card to play. And Anton was saying that he was feeling that the Beast Below is kind of like, it's just all right. It's not
Yeah, Vile Feast has felt really bad this format though. I just feel like it hasn't been able to
it's-
answer as many things. There haven't been a lot of 2-drops that you really want to answer outside of maybe like the 5/1 Challenger or a Jaw Hunters, I guess it answers. There's just not a lot of things in the format right now that it's really stopping. A lot of the curves this card hasn't been lining up as well. You've also got more tough seeing play. Got a lot more Rangers resolves out there now. People are really starting to
and
utilize
the
cards
Freljord
like
decks
that.
don't even have cards that you can target. Like, and there's a lot of Freljord decks. There's just the
there's so much
Trifarian Glory
Freljord.
Seeker.
That's the other
it.
thing.
Just
Yeah,
they
like-
have one card in the whole deck, and that's a specific list. That's it, the Ashe Noxus deck versus the Sej MF. This is a deck though that makes me think the Vile Feast could make a comeback in.
Yeah, I thought this. I wanted to bring this up, and we'll probably shortly after this go back to the classic elusives with Frey. But I wanted to start off with a deck that I feel we're going to see a lot of this week, and we already have been seeing a lot of this deck from, I think it was probably like Thursday, Friday, and then over into the weekend, where this deck really caught fire. Just another spin on elusives, which is already a very strong deck in terms of like an aggro strat, and then also trying to incorporate some of the burning aspects of Noxus, where Piltover and Noxus used to be the combination. I think this deck is trying to emulate both aspects of that deck. Strong early game with these Precious Pet and Navori Blade Scout. Yes, they're only 2/1s, but they're still poking. If they go unaddressed, they can do up to 6-8 damage in a game. That's obviously a huge deal. Conspirator, good synergy with the Blade Scout. I'm not. I would probably be hesitant to think about Navori Conspirator with only these one drops, but I also see the value in it with other things like Demolitionist and um, just being obviously a 2/2. It is
That
only two of it
solitary
because
monk synergy with Blade Scout is kind of insane in this deck.
yeah, that's where I really think there's some
And the
redundancy in this
conspirator
deck
as your,
list.
yeah, the one.
Yeah. For reference, we actually didn't create our own deck list for this one. We borrowed, I believe somebody made top 100 on an Asian server with it, and I happened to use that as our reference. But then just classic Noxus aggro cards: Grenadier, Discipline, Demolitionist, Greenblade Duo, one of the relics of unbut or unnerfed elusive guys. Still a very solid card. And if you notice, this deck plays all three of the unnerfed, very strong Ionia elusives. They are just insanely powerful still. Especially Solitary Monk, I would say, is the damage powerhouse that we're looking at here. On turn 3 with the attack, it's just an incredibly strong card to be playing. And then in a version of a deck like this, with Blade Scout and Demolitionist with the Crimson Disciple, while not consistently value, is still a lot of value. Even picking up your own assassin can be value in those grindy mid to late game situations where you just need some points of damage. You Shadow Assassin into some more damage. Very powerful. Retreat, interesting card to be playing with, almost like a pseudo negation, but at the same time, just recursion with the Blade Scout and things like that. Another Shadow Assassin, another Demolitionist. Transfusion to get those
Right, or
very
even
strong.
like picking up Demolitionist, then use the spell to shoot out a
Right,
Shadow
yeah.
Assassin.
Right.
That monk has so much synergy. Same with the conspirator. Like, there's so many plays in this deck that are just so much better. And like, just even like the extra Shadow Assassin value, as Anton said, the Demolitionist value, and even just protecting your board with it, of just taking cards with 1 HP off of the board. It becomes so hard to actually like deal with a lot of the cards in the deck.
Right, you could
Um,
think of this in this context as like a pseudo deny almost. You're picking your guy up to get the value off of it, and then also negating the damage or however they would address the unit itself.
Yeah, retreat's a little situational, Burn. So
Yeah,
like you don't want to brick on too many non-proactive cards in a deck like this, but it's a very solid trick as like sits in your hand for a little while. You probably never want to see more than one copy of that card because like I said, there's so many more proactive things that you can be doing with your hand. But
and then it's using Transfusion as a combat trick. Obviously, we've seen this card with Crimson
Card's nuts.
Disciple as a very punishing card in situations, albeit inconsistent, but still that power of punish with Crimson Disciple on an open attack. It creates a lot of damned if you do, damned if you don't situations where you either respect the transfusion and take a worse block, or you play right into it and get punished. And then Twin Disciplines, just a very strong card. The Fervor, incredibly strong card. And Will of Ionia, obviously, we talked about how if you're playing Ionia, you're playing 3 to 2 copies of this card. Even in this very hyper aggressive unit based deck, you're still playing 2 of them just by the sheer power of the card. And then obviously Decimate, just to, it's as pure damage as you get. So Decimate is great at ending those games. Always Reach, as we talk about, is incredibly important. So you want to play 3 of this card. Just that top deck potential. Shadow Assassin, when you're almost out of resources into Decimate could be a game. Just a lot of situations where Decimate gets you lethal. Anything more you want to say about this deck before I transition to the other Elusives deck?
yeah, I think one of the main reasons this deck became so popular is I feel like your deep matchup is much better than the old burn deck is because it just doesn't actually need to be winning on the board, and because the opening plays of that deck, the Boom Crew Rookie is just so much more answerable now, and it's just that was the strongest card in the deck by far, and also the rear guard on 1-star is not really as foolproof as it once was. It just seems like this deck is not only just better at doing what that deck is trying to do, and also better at doing what the elusive Freljord deck is trying to do, because the Noxus cards just add more reach to your deck. That's all your deck's trying to do is just burn your opponent out, like just race your opponent down as fast as possible. But also just the way that the meta shaped up, I think this deck just does very well against majority of things that aren't like as Karma and Heimer, but at the same time still have a reasonable way to beat those decks, even given their weak. The elusives have a strong weakness to both of those decks, considering the just mass removal and also the availability of elusive cards. But adding the Noxus cards gives you a better chance against those S tier decks, and then you have a solid chance, or just a solid matchup against like MF Sejuani because you just ignore their board. That it's a deck that's predicated on like having just a strong board through the whole game. You ignore it and just hit them in the face, and they don't have much interaction. Same thing with Deep, of like they have a strong board through the whole game, and then you're just, yeah, I don't care. I'll just kill you instead. Like that just seems like the better play. It's kind of just it just seems a lot more effective at what the Noxus Piltover deck was trying to do, and especially with the way that the meta's lined up, at how it lines up against those decks.
Right. Clearly, it's trying to take the what Noxus does best with these damaging cards and the strong units who also do damage, but trying to make it a little more consistent and even that damage open that damage threshold by using units with elusive as opposed to pure burn cards like Piltover used to add to this deck. So I think I hear myself for some reason. But anyway,
I was just loading up the stream on my phone, sorry.
Okay, no problem. But yeah, just it's clearly trying to capitalize on what both components of the deck do well, and also make it a little more consistent. But I think elusives in general have been seeing a lot of play, and I don't think it's a product of the meta. I think it's more so that people just forgot about elusives, and maybe they felt a little too passe, a little just they didn't really get a lot from this set, so it's boring to play the same old deck. But we've seen that elusives, just by nature, decks are unable to address them, therefore they're very powerful. Not even certain decks, even decks with elusives, if you just curve properly in a way where they're unable to touch these guys, and you amass a board and you play Wayfarer Hatchling or Windfarer Hatchling, it's just way too much to deal with.
Yeah, just elusives are just still I mean, like since the beginning of the game, as long as there's not too much easy counter like in the meta in the form of just like I think as Karma has a really easy time against this deck of just like it's mostly just removal of because your cards don't generate very much value and they're generally easy to kill. So as long as they can keep dealing with your board with removal spells, the deck loses all its effectiveness. But like a lot of people are just playing these board based decks, and that's exactly why the elusive Noxus deck is just very strong right now. And elusives in general is just there's not a lot of interaction. These people are just trying to play decks like MF Sej and Deep, and it's like you just ignore the board. They have the decks build very strong boards, and you just kind of close your eyes when looking at them and then hit them in the face. You don't really need to consider it, and you'll kill them before the board overwhelms you for the most part.
This deck definitely capitalizes on a consistent theme that we see in metagame where some of the most popular decks have the fewest interactions. Elusives does that better than any deck. It just flies right over your head with units that attack every turn. So unless you're addressing those cards, they're going to kill you before you can kill them.
Yeah, I think the main differences though between the Freljord version and the Noxus version is that this deck definitely has like a few more tricks to kind of play around the counterplay to the elusives in the form of like we have Elixir, we have more Twin Disciplines. The Deny, the Will of Ionia are definitely big ones for sure. And instead of trying to go for like the Noxus Elusive deck tries to beat its shortcomings of like what happens when the elusive plan fails by burning your opponent out and capitalizing on fewer amounts of hits, whereas this deck tries to just make the board more resilient, and there's less holes in the elusive plan, basically using them a little less like burn and just amassing damage over several turns to just end up winning and then bursting it at the end game. But I would say overall that I think the Noxus Elusive deck probably does a better way of covering the holes in the deck of your board kind of just having low statted units that are easily susceptible to removal. It's like just burning them out the rest of the way and requiring less hits in general, I think is the better way to do it and give decks less time to actually get back into the game. Because a lot of times against Elusive, it's like once you reach about like the mid game, like they can start stabilizing with just any form of removal or like attacking with units that are large enough that you're kind of forced to block with your guys if you can't kill them fast enough. But the Noxus Elusive deck can just kill them at that point. They have the solution to falling behind on board when their stats don't keep up. They just end the game. So
I'm surprised
what
these
elusives did you play for
lists
Light
aren't playing Fury of the North. Even like a couple of those.
It is worth noting that there are many variations of this deck. They might include Fury of the North. They might include Satchel of Spoils. Is that what the card's called?
Shared Spoils.
Shared Spoils.
Right, yeah.
Right, it might play that.
Yeah, there's a lot of different variations for sure.
I think it's the Wayfinder.
I think that overall,
thing,
I do like the Noxus one better.
Right, yeah. For anybody that's wondering in chat, which one would you play? I think this deck is towards the not at the bottom of the A tier, but like I would say lower on the
It's
A
more
tier scale, whereas
flimsy.
the Noxus Elusive one is probably towards the top end of the A tier
Right,
list
and I
at the
do
moment.
think that Nick identified the main reason why you would ever consider this deck over it is the Wayfinder. This card is incredibly powerful in terms
Yes,
of
that
tempo.
card's broken.
Just you play this card, you get double Omen Hawk, you get double Blade Scout, you get a combination. Insanely powerful play there.
Right.
Is Noxus version favored versus Freljord version? Oh, okay, sorry. Do you mean Freljord like Freljord decks, or do you mean the Freljord version of Elusive? Like
I
if they were
believe
playing
he
like an
means
Elusive
these two
mirror?
decks if they were playing against each other. I would give
These
the edge
two
to this
decks.
deck. I think
Because I think if you're talking about regular Freljords, okay, yeah, I was gonna say it probably does pretty well against most of the Freljord decks, but yeah, in the Elusive Mirror, I think this one is probably actually going to win out because
Yeah.
the Elusive cards have the same stats, but you outstat them, and your Elusive board not only blocks theirs, but then stays on the board. So your opponent just doesn't
Right.
deal damage to you, actually, like the whole game, and you end
Right.
up winning with the overall board.
Make this deck makes a really big Kinko Lifeblade, and then they're just
Yeah.
that other
Oh
deck
yeah,
is
That's
just fucked.
you just
right. In that mirror
it's
match,
over.
if you can just Jeweled Protector, King of Lifeblade, or if you can, even if you just Omen Hawk it, or any sort of, even if it just lives, it's going to always be damaging your lethal potential just by healing every turn, and also
and being an
having
elusive
tools.
walker.
Yeah. So
Least
I
favorite
think
part about this deck, and also the reason to play it, is the Wayfinder. I just feel like that so like in Bannerman, when your Bannerman missed, it sucked, but like you could live through it like your deck is still doing. I think if you play Wayfinder and you miss on your Wayfinder, you
That feels
usually
so
lose the
bad,
game.
dude.
Like
That's
like the
sad,
whole
Toro.
your win percentage on the game just drops so much. You can lose all the tempo that you've been building up those turns. So like that's probably why they don't play Fury of the North. I mean, it's like it's in consideration over the cards like Battle Fury and Elixir of Iron, and I think the reasoning is probably just that you want to just keep your guys alive, and Elixir of Iron is the cheapest possible way to do it in the early turns. So I can see why Elixir is probably better than Fury. But then Fury Fury of the North versus Battle Fury is, I think there's a solid debate for either one there of which one is better. It's like the Battle Fury is like we can end games from a while our opponent's at a higher life total but it's a little more risky, less consistent, but like the payoff is bigger in the deck with elusives. But like I don't know where I'm at on that. I really don't know if Fury of the North is better than Battle Fury. I see the upsides to both, and I think Fury of the North is definitely more consistent. Like without a doubt, Fury of the North is going to consistently just be a very strong card in that slot, whereas Battle Fury is more of the okay, this is just the high roll, like, and that can definitely get you out of some games where it didn't look like you were getting out of there. They'd probably you just wouldn't play it as a 3 of Fritz packs. You would just play it. It would just be a 1 of. You can't play more than 7 Freljord cards for sure. As we were talking about the Wayfinder of like you miss that
yeah.
Wayfinder, you just get pooped on. But like the Fury is just much more consistent. Sorry, they both have Fury in their name. That's very confusing. Fury of the North is far more consistent than Battle Fury. Should be used just about every game that you draw the card. Has more applications to a wider variety of things. But the Battle Fury is the like if we're playing a 1 of and it sits in our hand, we get the better high roll potential to just win the game on it. So unless they're cutting Elixir for Fury of the North, yeah, I don't know about that. I just think when you play cards like Zed in these early game elusive guys, that the 2 health is enough to protect them, and you just want the cheapest way to protect them. It's not
Yeah,
about pushing
Elixir
the
is
damage.
so good in this format. That's why Freljord is so good right now. I feel like it's a big part of it.
Tell me why Heimerdinger is nuts. Just went 26-2 and went from silver 2 to plat 3. I think you answered your own question.
Yeah.
Oh, you're saying like it's nuts, but I don't understand why, or just kind of. If you're in here literally any day where all we're doing is just really praising Heimer as our Lord and Savior for the most part,
Lord,
like
big
I got
brain.
a shrine set up in my closet here, some candles lit every night to Heimerdinger, just bow down a little bit, thank him for a beautiful win rate and a blessed day. Just saying it's the shit. Yeah, it really is. That deck is kind of ridiculous. It just has very few holes in the gameplay, and you really do just have a strategy against every possible deck.
So a deck that a lot of people I think
My
have
circle jerk. Could have said it better myself.
a deck that a lot of people have taken off their radar because of the, I don't want to say like the nerfs were because of this deck, but definitely a few of them were. Patch 1.2, a lot of it had to do with this deck in particular.
For sure.
But it's still very powerful, even though
This
it's
deck is
more
good.
right. This deck is just plain good. A deck that utilizes all 40 cards in the form of damage is very, very powerful. Just 9 1-drops, a lot of decks don't even play a single 1-drop, so if by virtue of you having a 1-drop on one, and if you have that attack, it's really strong. Just pure damage. Boom Crit Rookie, this card is still probably just like a Mystic Shot with legs, but
Yeah, that card's still just doing
still worth
value,
playing. For
used
sure.
to deal 5 damage on average, now deals 3 damage on average, sometimes even 2. Like,
yeah.
Card used to always hit twice, so like there's just 2 by there. This nerf effectively made this card just always deal 2 damage less, because for the most part it always attacks and gets blocked now, and just dies right there, or dies to something the turn it's played. But
Right, but
very
if you
little
just
anti-burn tech in
look
ladder
up
decks
and
right
down
now. Yeah,
this
absolutely.
list, it's just a strong deck, and a lot of decks don't have answers, or if they do not have them fast enough to answer a deck like this. Yes, it is worse objectively because the cards quite obviously got worse than they were before. So, but that doesn't mean that this deck is bad by any means. I think it's just not what people want to be playing because of maybe it is not as good as it once was, and people really thought of this deck as like, oh yeah, I just want to play the best deck. So, but yeah, I think it's definitely a consideration for not quite S, but still in that strong in that A tier.
I do have some. There's a lot of interesting like meta psychology and some macro movement with the meta of like why this deck went up and down, because it's like, okay, deck gets nerfed, it's definitely much worse, and it should be towards the bottom of A tier, but still a good deck. But then, as it was brought up in chat, a lot of people perceive this to just never be a threat anymore. We take out a lot of our anti-burn tech and start teching for the other decks that are becoming a lot more prevalent, because this deck, the play rate has just dropped rather than the deck's power level for the most part. So now people are playing a lot less of those cards. Well, now that ends up making the deck better again. And now what also happens is Heimerdinger, which was before kind of only being checked in power level by the absurd prevalence of Noxus Piltover, and you would still just have a ridiculous win rate because like it didn't lose every time to this deck, and it was just crushing everything else for the most part. So then more Heimer came up, so it's like, okay, now this deck is actually like a better A tier deck because it has such a strong matchup against what is arguably the best deck in the game right now is Heimerdinger. So it's really interesting how that works, and something that me and Matt were bringing up earlier, and all three of us bring up all the time on stream, of just like how matchup dependent this game is, and why the best deck is not actually the one that has the best strategy and the best cards when we're talking about purely from a ladder scenario of like, it's the one that it has the best win rate across the board. And the one that has the best, or sorry, is not the one that has the best win rate across the board, but the one that has the best win rate when you play the deck. And if all people played is Heimerdinger, if every single deck on ladder was Heimerdinger, then Noxus Piltover, in theory, is actually the best deck, is the number one S tier deck, because it beats the most played deck at a significant percentage of the time while still having like something to do against these other decks. Which is it's just very weird to think about how that works in Runeterra, but
yeah, if you just see the win rate of it right here, people are playing the Teemo version. I really just don't think that Teemo does more damage than a 3-1 still, but that's definitely debatable.
I think that it's just that maybe more people just always slam Omen Hawk on one, and then your 3-1s feels
right,
bad.
that is true that we
that's
see a
the
lot
number
of
one consideration,
strategies.
but
Yeah,
I do have some very strong cases for Rearguard, because like I've been thinking about this deck a lot lately, and this could even be a future deck guide that we might be talking about the state of Noxus Piltover right now. But one of like the really important things about Rearguard is like, if you look at all these decks, it's like exactly what Anton said. That's definitely the reason to play Teemo, is because there's so many Omen Hawks going around, and that you
And
actually
dredgers,
do
because lots of
get
deep.
yes, and there is actual blockers on turn one. But at the same side of that is that all of your 1-drops are significantly worse when your opponent actually starts a 1-drop. Precious Pet's the only one that is like kind of better, and like Teemo doesn't even end up giving you that much more damage. On average, Teemo deals 2 damage when it hits. It's essentially like another Precious Pet, but it actually just has no trading power. And one of the best ways to deal damage to the game of Noxus Piltover, if you look at it from like a macro point of view of what you see from turn 1 to turn 4 of how it plays out, the Rearguard actually gets a trade. The Rearguard actually kills something between the turn 1 and turn 3 mark, whereas Teemo often will just not do that. It'll just hit, and then you're hoping that it's going to hit again before it gets killed by some kind of like spell collateral damage or like something like that of that nature. But like the rear guard actually gets a guy off the board, and then your non-elusive guys actually start getting through. So like, say your Teemo keeps getting through, that means your non-elusive cards are not getting through. If you just look at like the number of units on your board versus the number of units on your opponent's board, if Teemo is not getting blocked, something else is. But rear guard getting blocked actually takes a card off their board, and your other guys getting blocked, that doesn't happen. So by playing Teemo, a lot of times you end up snowballing behind on about one unit. Just like through, I shouldn't say snowballing behind, but like you end up behind on one unit for the whole game. Whereas a lot of times in Noxus Filter, you can be ahead just one unit, which equals guaranteed damage every single turn. Where that Teemo is not easily guaranteed damage of just, over time that one health will get caught up with something. Like it's not foolproof, but there's the high roll potential too of just like Teemo is forever. So
there is a lot less of those cards though, right? Like the Vile Feast, the Withering Whales, things like that. Like the 1 health elusive is something that can keep getting in. There's not really a lot of elusive decks. We're not seeing them quite as often. So I could see merit to both for sure.
It's definitely, they're very close. I don't think it's as obvious though. Everyone's just like rear guard bad now. Go play Teemo.
Right. No, I agree.
There's
The
some very
rear guard with the attack still is like just a win if your opponent has no 1-drop. Like it's a win.
All right, I'm gonna read some comments from the chat. Sorry guys, on the podcast we turn like the sounds and notifications off, and we try and focus on actually talking rather than interacting with chat for the most time. Are you guys planning on doing a Sej MF guide? We might this week for sure. How do you guys feel about Noxus Shadow Isles burn? It's hard to see spiders being that powerful right now, but with Withering Whale being played far less, there's definitely the opportunity for it.
I think the elusive Noxus deck is the best way to go about playing some kind of like Noxus burn variation right now. I think it's just the most effective given the field at the moment. So not the Spire version, but I mean any version. I do think that like if you're looking to play the like go face burn strategy, I really feel that the elusive Noxus deck is the king of those decks at the moment.
For sure. And we're gonna wrap up the A tier with Ashe Sej, as we talked about before. Mostly a tournament deck, but still pretty solid on ladder. Just look at the curve, it's incredibly powerful. Assessors, when you get that really high roll Omen Hawk buff, can be insane in terms of value. Obviously in the end game, once you get to the Hearthguard, a much more consistent way to buff the Assessor. But yeah, this deck is just really solid. You see so much very clear value with Brittle Steel trades, Elixir of Iron trades, Flash of Freeze trades, Ashe trades, Rhymefang Wolf, Legion Drummer, Glory Seeker. It's all combat-based value. This deck also reminds me very much of Demacia. Just you're getting those value through trades in combat and tricks. Obviously, the difference would be Demacia relies on raw stats as opposed to using tricks to get that value. But this deck is very linear and straightforward. You're usually playing on curve, and you have a combat trick in your pocket to back up your battles. But other than that, this deck is not really that, yes, it's solid and consistent, but also just it's too linear for me to really want to play a lot of, but I recognize that it is powerful.
They're asking no Reckoning. No
Reckoning.
Reckoning.
Reckoning is a tournament card.
There's 3 different lists. I don't know. I'm kind of actually still on board with the Reckoning over Legion Drummer. I go back and forth though. There's three different lists though that are all like pretty solid. It kind of depends what you're seeing on ladder at the moment, but I think based off of what's being played the most, the Reckoning is really solid right now. And probably I just don't think you need 3 Legion Drummers or even Legion Drummer in general. That card's like pretty strong, but it's not like a unnecessary card. I'm a big fan of playing the Avaros and Trapper as well as the Reckoning in this deck. That's where that's where my personal biases lie. The Legion Drummer just seems like it lacks on the consistency side of the deck of like most of the cards just work by themselves and they don't really need to be like set up. And also like the 3/2 itself is like you sacrifice her to get a better advantage on a different unit. So I think from this list here, I'd probably be -3 on her and put in some like Trapper and Reckoning and maybe find space for the 3rd Trapper. But like that's 2 Trapper, 1 Reckoning. Maybe we find a 3rd Trapper somewhere else. Maybe we don't need 3 Rhymefang Wolves. We just play 2 of that card, but
Maybe we trim some of the tricks like an elixir or a flash freeze.
There's
Yeah,
definitely movement
like
and
one
flex
flash
spots
freeze.
to be made. This was
Right.
just this is definitely the older version of the deck. Um, Especially with the, like Nick said, the drummer is, I wouldn't say it's bad, but it is a relic of meta's past.
Yeah, it's still I still see drummer being played, but I don't know if they're the lists they're playing 3. I have queued into lists that are playing it, and it definitely does get you that strong Glory Seeker turn occasionally, or just with Rhyme Fang Wolf. I mean, it's solid too, but it might not need to be a 3 of. Like I said, there's a few tech slots here, chat for sure, and Reckoning is a card that I think right now, post 1.2, is a very strong card, especially like if that card resolves versus Heimer, you're killing their Heimer plus their entire turret board most of the time. Yeah, powerful card.
And we actually do see this deck, while it does have a few matches played with a fairly high win rate, but I do think that this deck is more optimized for a limited tournament format and would advise people not to play it as much, but it is pretty consistent on ladder. Just this deck doesn't have horrible matchups. It doesn't also have fantastic ones. I guess if you were to pick a very good matchup, it would probably be Demacia, just because the combat tricks and the free frostbite mechanic in general is just very anti-Demacia, winning those combats with a cheap spell. But that rounds up our A tier, and we'll compare our own list to what Mobalytics, what site we're using right now, would consider the tier list. And then we're gonna go into the B, and our B I think has a lot of controversial picks. It's mostly decks that have moved down in the pecking order as opposed to appeared and now are in that range. So we're gonna just talk about our first Demacia deck. It's crazy how Demacia is just not played anymore, but it was this deck and the region in general were really relying on the backs of Badger Bear and Grizzled Ranger to really propel them forward into that S tier. Demacia, as I talk about, to mostly in a negative way, but just if you want to look at it in an unbiased sense, Demacia gets its value through combat and raw stats. So when you take away those stats like a Badger Bear and a Grizzled Ranger, it really affects how powerful they are. And we've seen that whether or not it has to do with the idea of a card being nerfed just makes it less enticing to a metagame, and then once some people stop doing it, everybody has to adjust. But I do think this deck is significantly weakened by those adjustments. But still, if you still go, Cythria, War Chefs, Badger Bear, Bannerman, you're going to win a lot of games. So I think this deck still has places in the meta, and then obviously a card like Unyielding Spears is going to win you games just by virtue of being not countered by a lot of the decks. But against the decks we see in that S tier, again, Will of Ionia just shits on that card, so it's not even worth talking about. But this deck is still powerful, but I think it definitely sees the impact of patch 1.2.
Yeah, there's I mean, one of the biggest parts for this is that like there's two major changes other than just like the obvious nerfs, but like how that affected is like, okay, a lot of people are gravitating towards Freljord, and Deep right now are really popular decks, and Deep kind of just outclasses this card on board pretty easily, and how the only way you were really like beating it before was just the fact that you could race them so hard with the overstated cards of Badger Bear as well as Grizzled Ranger, and now those cards are just racing a few points slower, gives the deck actually a lot more time. Same thing with Heimerdinger. The deck just has more time. It's like your kind of nut curve doesn't actually kill your opponent fast enough. It usually gives them an extra 3, sometimes even 4 HP as the game goes on, which is enough for them to stay alive and just have a whole additional turn to stabilize against you. And that's usually where Demacia runs out of steam and kind of gets the corner turned on them. The other part of that is that like Freljord being so prevalent is that the deck is like, okay, Demacia has the better units, but Freljord has the better combat tricks overall, and this deck, it just doesn't have a whole lot of interaction in combat, so Freljord kind of just dunks on them for the most part. Like every time you're running against those freeze cards, the elixir, the brittle steels, like you can just get crushed on board so much faster against those decks. It's just a lot of times an uphill battle after even one really solid combat trick, but they have so many. There's several, and Culling Strike is in that deck too, and it, like that now actually just hits your Badger Bear. Even like that's like in the Noxus version, and then against the Sej version, it's like okay, like even like everything in the whole curve is just fine. With even like one Omen Hawk buff, you're kind of getting just absolutely dunked on. Any Brittle Steels, any Elixir of Irons, it's such a low mana interaction that you end up getting beat out in the curve. Sejuani too. Sejuani dunks on Demacia just as one singular card, just fucks your whole deck over. So I don't think it's and we still see Ionia decks. Those decks didn't go anywhere. So like your Unyielding Spirit is not like it's still in check a little bit. So
Yeah, I think that Riot again showed us how just slight stat adjustments really have an impact. In terms of like the game in general, I think Demacia is still powerful. We see that in Expedition, but just when you get to, when you get down to like refined strategy, Demacia is falling short because of those changes. So we can talk about a deck that really tried to capitalize on those two units in particular, and a lot of people ask constantly, is Lux Karma still good? I think it's still good, just clearly it used to be an S
so
tier.
much worse.
So much worse.
This is the biggest nerf a deck's ever gotten, but I think
in one patch for sure. Maybe some of the early Shadow Isles ones, but Shadow Isles was still really powerful.
Just because of the Jar Jar mask guy. What's up, Control? Yeah, I mean, like, I think this is the biggest nerf in terms of like number of cards in a deck that got nerfed in one patch. So like, it's really no surprise to see that it's just fallen so far from where it once was. There's 4 different cards, but 12 total cards in the deck that had substantial nerfs to them, like Grizzled Ranger, Badger Bear, Deep Meditation, and Karma. Like that's a lot for one deck to really recover from like where it's at. And it was so strong before that it's like this deck is still playable. This is still like it's not a bad deck, but it's really just it's nowhere near what it once was. It's so much worse. Like the mana efficiency of the deck is just tanked a lot.
Right, it's
also,
completely
like,
thrown off.
Yeah, it's not it's hard to say what specifically went wrong with this versus how the meta is now. It's mostly just that it does everything less effectively than it used to.
So much slower, clunkier, the stat changes on the Ranger, the Badger Bear. I mean, yeah, it's just everything just got a little bit slower for this deck. The deep med, it's taking a lot more mana to do what you needed to do, and everything else just is the way that the meta shifted, everything else is just doing everything a little bit faster, I feel like.
And the strategies, the most popular strategy in particular being MF Sejuani, that deck just absolutely shits on a deck like this. Just big units, steal cards from your deck.
Right.
This deck doesn't have answers to that, and it used to be in the form of fight fire with fire. You know, you're going to play your Badger Bear, I play my Badger Bear, and then I'm going to curve out in the end game with better value. But that doesn't work when nobody's playing these cards anymore.
Right.
If there's 4 decks at S tier, shouldn't it be called tier 1, like offset everything?
Yes, we're just using the terminology that they
tier
use.
Tier 2 always just, to me, feels like something that doesn't feel good.
Right,
like
gratifying enough.
Like, and I think that the A tier decks, it's like S tier is like something that I consider to be S tier, or that what we've considered S tier is like the deck does something broken, is kind of, and I would say that MF Sejuani is arguably not even an S tier deck. The deck is definitely more towards A tier, but
the reason I put it,
show stuff is split.
I put it in S tier based on
emphasis on the stupidity of what these decks do.
Right. If I was to really just choose an S tier in the pure sense, like one deck, I think I would, or I don't think, I know it would just be Heimer, but I chose other decks because A, it's the terminology that's used throughout the game right now. Yes, it's appropriating it, but that's, definitions change based on context. But also, I think in the case of Sejuani MF, it isn't an S tier deck, and what we would say is like your deck has to do something dumb, like an Ezreal Karma deck or a Heimerdinger deck, but its play rate, its win rate, and its consistency put it in that S tier to me.
Yeah, so if you play Heimer Vi well, it should have the highest win rate. The only time that Heimer Vi doesn't feel like the best deck is just if the deck of the day is just like Noxus Piltover or a specific version of Endure. Like the Wraith Caller variation, I think just has actually a really strong matchup of just like, but again, they still have to high roll. Like they still have to just open the ridiculous curve. It's really hard for you to just beat a curve that goes that wide. But when decks like that become the more popular deck, then as Karma is probably just like the best deck of the day. It's still Ionia Piltover. Like those decks are just ridiculous. They just have so few holes in the overall strategy, and their win condition is just way too strong and way too hard to deal with. It doesn't really like they truly epitomize the whole like I play one card and win the game. Those strategies are extremely powerful when they don't really like when you can still just play all these other good cards in the deck. Like decks that win around one card in card games are typically bad because they revolve around the one card and you play all these bad cards to make the one card good. But that's just not the case with those decks. Like they just play a deck full of good cards and then like they just play
and they naturally do what you want to be doing anyway.
Yeah,
Right,
there's only like a
conducive,
few
they're
questions
not clunky.
like Flash of Brilliance is obviously not a good card without a card like Heimerdinger, and cards like Key Guardian and Chempunk aren't specifically like powerful cards outside of the needs that deck has for cards like that, but like they're not even really that bad. Everything else in that deck is just like you're just playing a regular deck. Those are all just strong cards in both of those decks. Like all the removal cards. There's a few cards in Ezreal that are kind of bad. So I think BBG had success with Sejuani. I could see that for sure. The deck just doesn't really require any champions, so I could see Sejuani just being a good counter to a lot of the just like more mid-rangey decks and just anything that has stuff on board. You can catch up a lot. It's also just a good overwhelming.
Unnecessary though, given
it
the
could
overall
be.
strategy of the deck.
Kind of feel unnecessary and
right, and that's why I probably do want a
mono.
Yeah, champless version I think would be best suited, but we'll see as the week comes through. And another deck, as I said originally, the B tier is mostly decks that just got knocked out of A or S, and Corina Control is one of them. Took a huge hit in the form of not only Vi, like yes, this card is still very strong as we see in Heimerdinger, but not really what this deck wants to be doing to address those big fat creatures. But Brood Awakening really just took away a lot of the sting in this deck and the versatility. Elise was just so strong against a lot of the slower decks, like even Heimerdinger, where Brood Awakening Elise, and you flip, it's really hard to deal with. That deck doesn't have AoE. But then defensively, this card was, and that's why, from the reasoning from Riot, that this card got nerfed was that it was also a very good defensive tool. Just you create a board out of 5 spell mana. It's really just, it was too strong. And now we see it as probably just too weak. Very hard card to balance. And then just, you know, the normal stuff. But this deck in general is just, it was really good against Noxus, Piltover, and then Demacia, and both of those decks are not played right now, so this deck therefore is not as good. This deck is still giving Heimerdinger a struggle, but just really not where it used to be. It's kind of
specific, though, how it would give it a... The main problem, actually, before for Heimer was actually just Brood Awakening and Vengeance, were, like, more of the problematic cards for Heimerdinger, of just, like, a card that kills Heimerdinger that you can only really respond to with Deny, and another card that Heimer can only really respond to with Deny. And this was actually, like, one of the main reasons we were playing 2 Deny, even playing 3 Deny before the patch at times, just because this deck was so prevalent. But now that we just don't see this deck, this is probably the main reason to be playing multiple Denies in Heimer before, and now we're just down to 1, because like nobody plays this deck anymore. It's just fallen out of favor so far.
Yeah, for Heimer, there were so many cards you needed to stop.
I think Corina's nuts. But
yeah, I just don't see it.
This list saying it, but I think Corina is insane in this format.
I do agree. I'd probably be wanting to play why can't I think of that card now? What's the kill guy draw 2 cards?
The Glimpse.
Yeah, Glimpse. I think that makes this deck more consistent. But yeah, I just do think this deck is without a home at the moment.
Yeah, I think it's honestly my personal opinion. I think it's probably somewhere in upper A tier. I think that it just needs to change a lot. I think that you're trimming a certain amount of Brood Awakenings. The nerf definitely hurt it a lot. You don't want 3 of this card. I feel like maybe we still want to play 1 or 2. Just to randomly pop off with Elise, because no matter what, the deck's still going to be playing Elise because she's still a solid 2-drop. I mean, the best 2-drop probably in the game still. She always is getting in. She's creating 1/1s that trade with their Omen Hawks or things like that in the early game. And she provides a blocker late game. The Vi hit did hurt. This thing is not getting as much value as it used to, but it still is usually trading at least for 2 things. So, I mean, that's just a removal spell, which is what this deck wants to do. I think in my list, I trimmed a Corina because you're just not needing. You're not getting to. If I'm getting to turn 9, I need to play Ledros, and the decks currently are really fast. And I honestly would usually keep Ledros in my opener for mulligans unless it's a very fast deck. And then I'm playing additional atrocities because Ledros Atrocity is just something that a lot of decks can't deal with right now, and more people are playing 1 deny than ever. So like a lot of spells are just popping off. I'm also playing Max Runation because I think that it's just the way that this deck's mana curves out spell wise. Like that's what I was saying about Brood Awakening. For instance, Brood Awakening, before you could on turn 3 you had 6 spell mana, so you were able to play Brood Awakening, bank 1 still, and then you're able to go into round 4 with 4 spell mana. You still have 1 banked, and you're able to cast a second Brood Awakening. You can no longer do that, so I don't think that you won't be wanting. You don't want to be running 3 of this card anymore, but it is still a powerful card. If you do want to go wide, it is still a strong card versus like Heimer on turn 3. That gives you like a really solid board, and if you like can drop Elise after that and just get a random flip, it's really powerful. And I just think like no one's playing Whale right now, so it's usually a pretty safe play as well. I do think that you want to be playing Aristocrat now. Like before, some lists were not playing it, but I think that it's an insane blocker, especially versus the MF Sejuani decks. You have a lot of big 5/5s that are always just slamming down, but they can't actually get over this card, and this thing gives you 2 different blocks and sets you up for those Runation turns. Then you're able to just, after playing Runation on 6, when they drop their Sedge, then you just have Vengeance on 7 to deal with whatever big thing they play after that. And then you're just leading up to when you drop Ledros, and that deck just really can't deal with Ledros to begin with. And then on top of that, if you've dealt at least 1 damage, then he takes them down to 9, and then you drop an Atrocity and you win the game because that deck has literally no response to that unless they play Harsh Winds. But yeah, it's really, really powerful. I feel like it's just being underplayed right now, and people aren't looking at it because the decks that it was farming before, like Burn, really aren't seeing as much play either. But yeah, I think that there's a place for it in the meta right now for sure.
Yeah, I think my main problem with the deck and where it kind of was falling out of favor was that like it kind of struggled against a little bit more of these like mid-rangey aggressive decks that just had like I feel like against like the Sej MF deck, like it sometimes kind of struggled in that mid game. Is a little questionable of like cards like Brood Awakening were very important to hit in the early game. Like Elise just doesn't really cut it right now. Like, and it's why I don't even like it in Endure. It's like just the way that a lot of these curves are lining up. Like people are just playing like Jagged Butcher on 2 with Plunder all the time, like left and right, or Omen Hawked cards on turn 2 all day long, and it just becomes a little bit more annoying to deal with those cards. A lot of like mid-rangey threats in general from those decks that like sometimes it gets a little annoying to deal with in the early game without that easy access. As you said, also the just like the lack of the farmed matchups, it definitely drops your win rate when you don't get free wins. But then at the same time, it's like we're starting to see more of these like elusive decks come back into the meta, and I think it gives this deck more reasons to be played. I'm still of the opinion that this deck is probably closer to A tier, but it's kind of hard to say just because like it's just been played so little. It's been played so little since patch 1.2. Another strong case for it probably still being a pretty good deck is that Lux Karma was a pretty hard matchup, I think, for this deck beforehand, and now that deck doesn't really exist.
Right.
There was so many things that deck could do that like this deck couldn't really do, of just or couldn't deal with, of just it had all of the Ionia cards that were very strong. It had infinite value. It had a bunch of great ways to heal. Like it had Unyielding Spirit. It just had so many things that were like felt like kind of auto wins against this deck. And that was what pushed Corina, I think, out of the meta in the first place. Was Lux Karma.
Unyielding
Like, the
Spirit.
deck
Yeah,
it was, like,
Unyielding
really
Spirit
strong.
in general. We had a really strong Demacia deck and a really strong Lux Karma deck, both running Unyielding Spirit, which naturally just crushes
But like
this
now
list.
it might see a little more playback, and I think it can probably deal with the Freljord deck. But there's some really awkward curves of like where your 3 damage cards just start to fall short by 1 repeatedly. which can just cause a lot of problems there of like your grasp, even your get excited, your static shock's not doing enough against a deck like that. Your withering rail doesn't do enough. Like it's just a lot of the spells have become less effective, but the win condition package is still very strong. So I feel like a lot of the other decks, like where it's falling out of favor, is just that other decks are more effectively making it towards their late game win condition a lot of the time. And like Brood
Yeah.
Awakening is another huge hit of that. It's like all your spells are less effective based on where they line up, and then your best, most universal spell costs a mana more now. So before you used to be able to go play a 2-drop, play a 3-drop, play Brood Awakening on 4, or skip just turn 1, or sorry, just turn 2. You could still play a card on turn 1 if you wanted to, and then be able to like Brood on 3. So it's kind of there's like it's weird to see how it's like it has like so many shifts up and down with how the meta has gone back and forth, and it's hard for me to say exactly where it is. Like initially I look at the power level of the deck and I'm just like, this should be A tier, but just thinking about like where a lot of these cards line up against the card, it's hard. It's really hard to like see where it places, and I don't want to. I guess I don't want to be the one to try it out and like figure that sample size, but like it's hard to believe that like a core this strong that's been so fucking strong in Legends of Runeterra for so long, it just wouldn't be an A tier deck because like I mean Ladros and
Ledros is just the win con. He is
like
just the win con.
Right.
yeah,
So
like that card's absurd. So
I have two final thoughts about this deck and why I don't think it's why I think it is B tier very fairly. One, Elise, as Nick mentioned, this card, while yes, I do think in just the sense of like how good this card is in a vacuum, I think it's still the best 2-drop, but it's just not 2/3s we see are just not playable right now because people are playing 3-attack things on turn 2 very often. You need to be able to trade, and Elise can't do that. And my second thought is that yes, I do think if you were to retool this deck, it would be a Ladros Atrocity deck, but we see decks that are doing that better right now than this deck. So
right.
they're
more effectively winning the game and more effectively getting to their win con. The main part is getting to the win con, I think. Like, because Corina and Ladros are still really strong. It's just like what was so good about this deck before is that it played like an Ezreal Karma deck of like it was really fucking hard to like get the leg up on this deck with so many control spells through the game, and then they just kill you. But now a lot of your control spells in the Shadow Isles package specifically feel just very underwhelming and a little underkitted. And yeah, like what we were saying about like the Elise and the Brood Awakening, it's like those cards are just less effective now too. Everything just got like they're just a little less effective than they used to be, making it not bad, but replaced by things that probably do a similar job more consistently.
So another deck, like we said, just got bumped down a little bit, is this TF Swain deck, and there's a lot of variations and versions of the deck. This is not a plunder. This is not the Klepto version, as you can see. This is just a copy and paste of dogs, and while I do find it perplexing, I thought it was probably the most played version of it, therefore I chose it. But yeah, I think this deck was a good answer to, like I said, and we see a lot of these B-tier decks were good answers to Noxus Piltover and Demacia, and now with those two decks being played less, that makes this deck a lot less powerful. I think if I were to retool this deck, I would make it more about Plunder and Riptide Rex as opposed to going for like this answer the board strategy, or I would make it like a very aggressive deck with the one with the Butcher and just going wide early with thick guys instead of like Sentry and just like this value going like addressing the board deck. Guillotine is a pretty awkward card. Yeah, I don't think this deck is cutting it at the moment.
Yeah, I agree. I'm a fan of the Riptide Rex decks, but I don't think that the current TF Swain deck is really up to snuff. It's a solid deck. You'll get some wins with it, but the win rate is not where it needs to be. Its matchups just aren't what they were last format because everything is just kind of shifted. And even last format, it really was just kind of a meme deck. I mean, it does some really cool things, and I like what it's doing, but it just doesn't do it well enough yet for it to be where it needs to be higher up in the tier list.
Yeah, I think the best way to put it is like something that I know we'll talk about a lot of like what it takes to be an S tier deck. The deck is simply too fair. That's like the best way to put it. All these cards, you're like this is like a good synergy, like well-rounded cards, has like it's like a pretty versatile, like feels like a jack of all trades deck of like the deck just has like a lot of good lines of play, a lot of good ways to like control the board, make some proactive plays, like kind of the epitome of like what feels like a mid-range deck of just like good reasonable cards, but like it does nothing unfair. There's nothing, not a single card in this deck other than I would say Riptide Rex probably that's like actually just unfair. Like when it happens, your opponent looks at it and they're just like, oh fuck, like that. You know what I mean? It's like there's something like that in every Runeterra deck that's S tier. Like when it happens, I think that's like, I don't know if that's the exact metric that we want to hold broken cards to, but something that makes your opponent say, "Oh fuck" when you play it. That's kind of like that's the S tier factor, right? Of like something that's just so powerful. It's just like we don't really have like reasonable ways to answer these things, or I have to play my whole game based around it. Most of the things in the Swain deck of like when they happen and I'm just doing whatever deck I'm playing, you don't really need to adjust your strategy all that much. Like you just run your deck as normal against this. They play cards that just don't efficiently deal with what you're doing fast enough. Like that it doesn't do anything unfair. It doesn't make any proactive plays that are too hard to stop, and it doesn't make any reactive plays that are oppressive. Like they're just all fair for the most part.
Yeah, chat was mentioning that this is likely a more of a tournament deck. I do agree. It is a good way to utilize
And that's where
some
we did
odd
see
elements like Bilgewater and Noxus. And that is
Right.
originally where we did see it and took it on ladder for a few runs just to see how the deck played, and it did play really well, but yeah, just not well enough on the actual ladder format for it to be something you want to consider if you're trying to climb.
And then
Very
our
enjoyable if you're a mid-range player for sure. But now we have there's better use of Bilgewater in the form of Deep is clearly just like the reliable tournament deck, and Noxus also has the Freljord Noxus, so like it felt like a better tournament deck last patch. Moving in this patch, the tournament decks have seemed to shifted the use of both of those regions. What are you gonna say, Matt?
And then I was just going to lead into our final deck that we considered even putting on a tier list, but we'll talk about Mobalytics, which we consider like the standard, and then we'll talk about other decks for sure. But rounding out our B tier is a Keg Control. Anton, I think that you feel strongly about this deck more than Nick or I, so I'll let you take the reins on this one.
Yeah, for sure. I think that this is a very interesting way to use Ledros as well. I do think that the Shadow Isles control package does fit really well in the format, and this is a more board-based deck and just a way to utilize like the. Am I not seeing the plunder cards on this one?
Oh yeah,
This
this
is a
wasn't
little
the
bit
list
different
Anton
of
was
a.
playing. Yeah, Anton has a entirely
Yes.
different. So there's two main lists for anybody that's watching. I guess we can go and discuss that. And like, there's one that uses the plunder cards, and then there's one that goes more towards the
This
board
one's just a
control.
barrel. Yeah, board control. The board control one I think is better for the current format because it does answer the Heimer board states and the Endure board states much better. But I think that the Plunder one handles. I mean, you're playing the Plunder package, and I think that that's just such a strong package, and you're playing that on top of the powerful late game things like that this deck can do with Riptide Rex, Ledros. Dreadway is a win condition if this card does stick, and then you drop a Riptide Rex, your opponent's pretty much dead. If you drop a Ledros, they're actually dead. That's another reason why you play one of Ledros, though it is just a solid card in general. I actually was a fan of playing Atrocity in this list as well because you do play Ledros, and even after a Riptide Rex, like sometimes you can just Riptide Rex them down to a pretty reasonable amount, usually less than his what is he at? 7-4, right? 7 attack, and then you can Atrocity them for 7 with him. Yeah, the barrels, of course, more powder, and like Withering Wail or Grasp is insane. Dreadway, of course, doubles your. I don't remember the exact math of how Dreadway plus your barrels works, but there's some insanely powerful things that this does. Dreadway also just makes your like Grasp of the Undying drain for 6 and do crazy things like that. It's a powerful board-based deck. Twisted Fate is a
Or
really
with
versatile
the
card, and
it's like you get
right.
the double damage with the grasp because of the it's the Dreadway that kegs. It's like the and GP and Twisted Fate and all that, but it's
Right.
like Dreadway can attach to your spells because of the
But
kegs. It's like
Dreadway makes
protection.
Dreadway makes all double all the damage by your allies. And so I remember that there was a specific scenario where someone had a really crazy giant what's the 0 mana card deal a damage warning shot. Opponent played like an 8 damage warning shot because he had like 2 barrels and a dreadway or something like that. And I think that maybe for each barrel it was 2 damage.
Oh yeah, it was just like double.
But then it like it started multiplying. I need to actually experiment with that a little more with the
the
more
barrels
powder
deal
version.
the 1 extra damage, but 2 extra damage with Dreadway, and then it was like warning shot.
And then the spell itself also deals more damage because Dreadway also increases the spell's damage as well as the barrels increase as well.
It's just the damage from the allies of like the
allies,
the spell it gives spell damage basically through the powder kegs. It's pretty the convoluted chain of like how this card buffs them, but like with all the spells in your deck and like Dreadway, it's just like every spell becomes like a fucking nuke. Like Make It Rain with even a single barrel with Dreadway.
Yeah, that's an insane card.
It's 3 damage to 3 cards. It's like or 3 targets, so it's very
Vile
strong.
Feast with a more powder can kill a Heimerdinger.
But yeah, both versions of that deck are definitely pretty strong. I'm definitely with Anton though. I do like the Plunder version more. I like Yordle Grifter in that deck a lot too, of getting warning shots to your hand because like warning shots a little too weak to play as an actual card in that deck, but having the Grifter gives you good value, good units on board. Not a huge fan of the what is it? The Petty Officer. I like the 2-drop. Petty Officer I go back and forth on. Like I don't know if it's like a 3 of. It's pretty strong though. Like it's I don't know. I might just be wrong about that card.
Yeah, this is the barrel version too. So I mean, you're playing more powder, you're playing deckhand, and you're playing Petty Officer and Gangplanks. As many powder keg cards, it's playing the full powder keg package.
Right. I'm a fan of the we just get rid of the more powders and potentially some of the top end of the spells, and then we get the plunder package. And I'm down for the atrocity too in this deck. I don't remember if we were running it originally, or maybe you had it in and I didn't have it in the version that I had made. But like I can definitely get down with atrocity. You can get a chump blocker if you do with the Petty Officer. Yeah, Petty Officer is the one that I'm like on the fence about, but like I like the plunder cards a bit more. But that one's definitely fine. More powder is the one that like I would rather get rid of that card and then just play the
I think it was Enrico's list, Dog of Wisdom's list that I had originally taken and just kind of tweaked a little bit, but I know that he was playing like the plunder package.
Yeah. Trade more powder for Grifter. Yeah, that's a start, and then you can trim some of the numbers on some of the other cards in here, and then you might be able to fit the Black Market Merchant and the Pilfered Goods. They're pretty strong. But if anything, I would like to just at least fit the Yordle Grifter without the other ones, because the warning shot is just really, really strong.
Yeah, great card.